morning. I hope that the enthusiasm level did have to do with the sugar last week, or last Tuesday rather than today, and it's not the topic. And I don't see quite as many people when we had land use planning for gardening as we do for cities, which is kind of disappointing. It's a little intimidating to talk to you today because this is a room full of people, many of whom I interacted with during my career. It's funny the different points of view that land use planning touches people's lives, but I have colleagues from the state that I worked with that are in this group, and I have fellow co-workers who I worked with as a planner for the city of Salem. I have neighborhood activists. I have elected city council members that I worked with as a planner. I think the only contingency that isn't represented today are developers, which is, developers, believe me, I've encountered lots of developers over time, and they can be challenging, but they're also an essential component of what makes a community happen, and I don't know why they're not joiners of ICL, though. Well, with that, let me get started, and I want to start with a story. Once upon a time, there was a young girl who liked to get things done. She planned to go to college. Lo and behold, the summer before college, the young girl went to Hawaii and fell madly in love. Before the end of the first semester of college, the young girl, who liked to get things done, was pregnant. No more college for her. A few years later, the young girl, now a young mother, found herself with a new husband and another child. The new husband wanted to go to college, so the family moved themselves to Eastern Washington University. And the young mother came to be jealous. She wanted to go to college too. So she began to take classes, and before she knew it, the young mother, who liked to get things done, was a full-time student. But the young mother had a big problem. There was no daycare on campus. What was she to do? Lo and behold, she looked up and saw a poster on a bulletin board, meeting tonight about daycare on campus. So the young mother went to the meeting. There were about 20 people at the meeting, and they were mumbling and grumbling and complaining, and mumbling and grumbling and complaining, and they mumbled and grumbled and complained some more. And the young mother, who liked to get things done, was very frustrated. And behold, the door swung open and a bright light appeared. In walked a person who said, "I'm here to help you." The person asked the group, "What is the problem you're trying to solve?" And they all said, "We don't have a place for our children." And the person asked them, "So what is it that you want to accomplish?" And they all said, "We want a safe and affordable place for our children." And the person said, "What do you know about your problem?" And they all said, "There are many of us, and there's no daycare on campus." And the person said, "What things do you have that could help you solve this problem?" And they all said, "We have an empty classroom." And the person said, "What are different ways that you could solve your problem?" And they all said, "We could hire someone to take care of our children, or we could take turns taking care of each other's children." And the person said, "Which of those solutions best accomplishes your goal?" And they all said, "Taking care of each other's children is both safe and affordable." And behold, there was a plan. After the meeting, the young woman said to herself, "I want to get things done like that person." And she asked the person, "Who are you?" And the person said, "I am a planner." And so the young woman became a planner too. So you can kind of guess who that story was about, I think. And I am a person who likes to get things done, and I found land use planning to be about getting things done, organizing things. There's kind of two different kind of people I see that go into land use planning. There are the artistic, creative types who want to make beautiful cities, which is a great thing. And then there's the organizer type like me, who wants to go into land use planning. I think probably my type gets a little more gratification than the Make City Beautiful planners, because it's a little more immediate to organize things. But while I like to get things done, and that spoke to me and made me want to be a land use planner, I also like immediate gratification, and I want people to like me. Well, then maybe it wasn't the best career choice from that perspective, because land use planning is about the future, the far future, not the immediate future, but a long ways away. So the fruits of the work that you do can take years and years before it becomes evident. But the process of planning is very much like the process of creating a daycare at a college university. And it's true for any major problem that you have to solve, and it's the way that you plan communities too. You first have to know what the problem is, and you have to identify where it is you want to get, and you have to collect and analyze information about that. You have to decide what are the different ways you could make it happen and pick out the best one of those different ways, and then you have to actually make it happen. You have to find ways to make it happen, and then you don't just quit. You have to monitor that and make sure that it continues on the path that you think it's going. So why would you do a plan for a community? Well, it gives you the opportunity to think about and to imagine and to determine what you want your future to be as a community. It gives you the opportunity to talk about that with many people and try to come up with a vision so that you have an image of where you want to go. It also provides you, if you know where you want to go, the basis for making decisions. So as every decision comes up to you, you can compare that to where it is you want to go and see if it gets you along that line or if it diverts you from that. Also, planning is about the allocation of scarce resources. We don't have an infinite amount of water. We don't have an infinite capacity to treat our sewage and keep our environment healthy. We have limits to that. And planning, knowing where you want to go, helps you identify how to use those resources in the most efficient way. And it does set a framework for that infrastructure, so you know where to run those water lines or those sewer lines or the roads, because you know what it is you're looking for. Now, planning in Oregon started about the time of the Oregon Trail with the donation land claim. And during that time, that was where if somebody came out and settled along the Oregon Trail, you would get 360 acres of land for your own ownership. It was the first time that ownership in the West of private property really came to be. And in fact, during that time of that Donation Land Act, there were 29 million acres that was converted into private ownership. I'm not quite sure what the Native Americans thought of that, but yes, it's true, but it is our history, and it's what we have to work with from today. Meanwhile, though, there was a national move on about land use planning, particularly in the cities. There was found, as cities began to grow, people flowed into the cities, there was a conflict between the kinds of uses that there were in cities. So you might have somebody living next door to a slaughterhouse, and that created a lot of problems. And law began to be established to help prevent that. And the first laws really were zoning laws that were established to do that, to try to separate uses so that you didn't have the mixing of noxious uses with uses that could be negatively impacted by that. That all happened in 1919. The City of New York adopted an ordinance. In 1920, the federal government actually created some model ordinances for zoning, and then zoning became official and completely legal with the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Euclid versus Ambler, which supported the police powers of zoning, which gives the communities the right to establish laws that regulate people's property to protect the community interest. It's a police power, just like protecting your security, well established by law here in the United States. Meanwhile, back in Oregon, cities were granted the authority in 1919 to establish zoning. Not required, but granted the authority to do so. But even then, Oregon had a sense that you couldn't just walk in and decide how to separate things. You had to do it in accordance with a plan. a considered plan. And so even the very first planning efforts in Oregon were based on at least some semblance of an effort to try to look at the whole picture and divide your land uses up from that perspective. And then along came the 1960s and the environmental movement. Hot topic in the nation, especially hot topic here. And as Oregon became more aware of environmental concerns and the nation became more aware, they actually adopted a state law, the forerunner of land use planning in Oregon, which was Senate Bill 10, and it was essentially a requirement now, not just an option, but a requirement that comprehensive plans be adopted and land use ordinances, regulations, or laws to implement that had to be adopted by cities and counties. And there were 9 goals that were included in that law. They basically talked about preserving air quality and water quality, prime farmland, and then an orderly and efficient transition from rural development to urban land. However, there was no funding and no enforcement related to that law. So it was, while the meat of it was there, the ability to actually get something done was limited. And then there was a governor called Tom McCall, who had quite the knack for language, and he had in his heart land use planning for the state of Oregon. He loved Oregon, he loved the environment of Oregon, and when he looked around, he saw things going in a direction that he didn't think was good for the state. And he had no qualms about expressing what he thought about it. You can see the colorful language that he used. Tom McCall was the guy who said, "Come to Oregon to visit, but don't stay." Remember the sign, "Don't Californicate Oregon"? This is all during this era. And by golly, that carried itself into Senate Bill 10, which was the groundbreaking law in Oregon and across the country, actually, about land use planning, establishing a solid system of land use planning for our state. And that was a bipartisan effort. The outgoing governor, who was a Republican, and the incoming governor, who was a Democrat, sat together at the table to testify to support adoption of Senate Bill 10. And Senate Bill 10, or Senate Bill 100, had the same basic kind of fundamental themes that Senate Bill 10 did. Preserve the resource-based economy, control urbanization, provide necessary infrastructure for commerce and industry, and preserve the Willamette River Greenway and coastal areas, and it had some teeth in it as well. The land use planning program adopted 19 statewide planning goals, and those goals addressed the really big ticket items of citizen involvement. That was a key component to the initial land use laws in the state of Oregon, protecting agricultural and forest land, trying to focus growth in urban areas, because how do you best protect agriculture and forest land if you have spreading urban development? It's hard to do. So the whole theme behind Oregon land use planning is to concentrate growth into lively and livable urban areas while preserving the resource lands that are outside of them. It also tried to link different elements of planning. So there's a built-in link in the land use planning goals between transportation and development, economic development, and urban development. It is created to try to address all of the different pieces that have to come together to create a considered and viable plan. The way that the system works is there are the 19 statewide planning goals, which are adopted at a state level. And Oregon revised statutes and administrative rules that provide direction about how those goals are to be implemented. And then the enforcement measures had to do with creating a Land Use Board of Appeals, which is a special court to consider land use decisions only. So instead of land use decisions getting bogged down in a court system that isn't experienced with them, there was an actual appeals board that was created to deal specifically with those and try to expedite them. And then finally, there was a commission developed, and that commission had authority to overview all of the local steps that were taken to make sure they were consistent with the statewide planning goals. At the local level then, so you had all of this big structure up at the state level. At the local level, jurisdictions, cities and counties were required to adopt a comprehensive plan, to adopt a land development ordinance, and then individual permit decisions that they made had to be consistent with the rules that were created, the comprehensive plan upon which that was structured, and the statewide planning goals upon which the comprehensive plan was structured. Here's a little bit more graphic picture of how that works with the state up at the top developing laws and the local jurisdictions actually doing the planning work on the ground in the communities. So of the 19 goals, they're not all equal. And they concentrate more in some areas than others, and some of them are very lightly treated, and some of them are very detailed and complex, and some of them over time have evolved to be implemented in even more detailed and complex ways. There are 2 goals related to the process, or how do we get this done? You know, what are the steps that have to be taken? There are 5 goals that relate to development inside cities. What should urban development be like? There are 8 goals that address resource protection, and there are 4 that talk about coastal protection. The 2 process goals, the first one is all about citizen involvement, and it's quite detailed and quite deterministic about what has to happen. There has to be citizen involvement at all phases of adopting a comprehensive plan. So in the first collection of data for that plan, the adoption of the plan, the adoption of the rules that implement the plan, and even in individual land use decisions that occur. And that's why you see around town, you walk around town and you see those signs that say public notice. Well, that's part of the citizen involvement component dictated by state law. It's required in all phases, and it must be easily understandable, and jurisdictions have to actually provide some funding to make it happen. The second goal is about exactly how the plan should be developed. So it lays out basic procedures. It says everybody has to have a plan. That plan has to be factually based. It has to have specific data. You have to go through specific steps. And you have to have regulations to implement it. The plan has to be acknowledged by the state, has to be coordinated with other jurisdictions. So Salem has a comprehensive plan, and they actually share an urban growth boundary with the city of Kaiser and are located in 2 separate counties. So all 4 of those jurisdictions have to work together in order to create the plan. And those plans have to be reviewed periodically so that it just doesn't remain stagnant. As time goes on, the state will call up those plans and say, we want to take a look and see how things have changed, how you're growing, how consistent you continue to be with the statewide planning goals. The first, and maybe the most important goal for cities of the urbanization goals is goal 14, which is the goal on urbanization. It's all about focusing growth in urban areas and making efficient use of that land. It's complex and detailed and has been frequently challenged over time and has gotten more and more complicated, which makes it more and more onerous to comply with it, which slows things down. But it also has been a source of great achievement in trying to accomplish what the statewide planning goals are trying to do. What it requires is that communities estimate or get a projection for what the future growth is going to be for that community, and then take a look at how much land there is available to accomplish that. What kind of land that needs to be. Does it need to be housing? Does it need to be for jobs? What land do we need to accomplish to accommodate the growth that we're expecting in our community? And then that all has to be coordinated with the other development goals. Goal 14 requires that an urban growth boundary be set. So an urban growth boundary is a boundary within which urbanized development can occur. Usually there are city limits inside that. And so it's an area of undeveloped land, includes an area of undeveloped land that can accommodate growth for the future. And that has to be for a 20-year supply. In doing so, it has to be based on a 20-year coordinated population forecast that comes from the state. And each community has to demonstrate that they can meet the needs for housing, employment opportunities, public facilities, streets, roads, parks, open space, and they have to consider the carrying capacity of the land as well as the recreational needs of a community. And all of the jurisdictions within the boundary have to adopt it. So the urban growth area for Salem and Kaiser are adopted by Salem, Kaiser, Marion County, and Polk County. And that boundary can't be changed without demonstrating that there's a need for additional land. The other goals that are development goals are economic development, housing, public facilities and services, and transportation planning. The economic development goal, another one that has evolved to be complex and detailed. There's a lot of argument over it. It requires that communities analyze economic patterns, potentialities, strengths, deficiencies, that you really look at what do you want, what might you actually achieve when it comes to economic development. You have to have policies on economic opportunities, so communities have to take a look at that and determine what kind of policies they want. And there has to be an inventory of commercial and industrial lands, and that has to be compared to what the future needs are, and then make sure there's enough land to go around. Housing, the same way. You have to have plans to accommodate needed housing. Now, housing, again, is a very controversial subject. Put in your heads, if someone wanted to build an apartment building right next to your house, how might you feel about that? And guess what? We need apartment buildings desperately in our communities. But finding places for them can be hard. And what's happened over time is, and this particularly I think comes from the development community, there has been lobbying to help assure that those kind of projects can be approved. And so if a project is proposed that is defined as needed housing, so that's a housing to meet a certain income level in your community, only objective measures can be applied. The I don't like the way it looks in my neighborhood measure won't work. It's got to be based on the rules that are in place, and if they meet the rules, it would be approved. So that's a goal that's gotten harder and harder to meet, and more complex as people fight through the court system about what works there and what doesn't work there. Public facilities and service planning, again, that's about timely, orderly, and efficient. You know, the trick there is that you try to coordinate the timing of them with the development. So you don't build a bunch of expensive stuff ahead of time and have it laying fallow there with all the costs that goes with it, but you don't build the houses first and then not have any utilities for them. So that law is all about how do we make it timely, orderly, and efficient. And it needs to match the capacity or the needs of the community. Transportation, probably the most complex of all of the laws. Transportation is probably the most complained about issue in communities. If you ask people, you know, what don't you like about your community, 99 times out of 100, they're going to say, we have too much traffic. I can't get through town. How's the traffic grown in Salem? What's it take to get from South Salem to Kaiser these days? It's a frustrating experience for people. And transportation improvements are controversial and they're expensive. How do we minimize automobile trips, which the Transportation Goal 12 is all about, actually? How do we have fewer trips so we can have more efficient circulation using other kinds of modes of transportation? But it needs to be safe, convenient, and economic, and people have fought those battles. And developers who put in improvements, which they frequently have to, pay millions and millions of dollars in order to put in an improvement to keep the transportation system working. And as you can imagine, people who don't want their streets overcrowded have fought that through legal battles, and developers who don't want to pay a lot of money has fought that through legal battles. There are 8 natural resource goals. The first one is Goal 5, and that deals with things like riparian corridors, wetlands, wildlife habitat, groundwater resources, frequently things that you might find in cities. And this is another complicated and pretty prescribed goal as it has developed over time, the laws that enforce it. Protecting wetlands, I think, has been particularly controversial over time. What the goal requires to happen is that communities inventory and determine the significance of these kinds of natural areas in their communities, and then protect them if they are significant, and then find some way and balance to allow conflicting uses. So you can imagine why that one has gotten difficult to live with. Goal 7 is kind of the flip side of trying to save our natural areas. It's more trying to protect us from the hazards that our natural areas might create for us. So these are the rules that apply to things like flooding, earthquakes, tsunami. The other natural resource goals are somewhere here. Deal with agriculture, forest lands, air, water, and land resources, recreational needs, energy conservation, and the Willamette River Greenway. They vary in how complex they are. As you can imagine, agriculture and forest land were one of the first things that was recognized to be protected. Those are pretty complex, and boy, if you own land in a county in the Willamette Valley and you're outside an urban growth area, there's just some pretty strict limitations about what you can do with that land, and there's some incentive built into the tax laws to help protect it. But over time, again, that has gotten more and more complicated. The air, water, and land resource quality is really kind of a lightweight goal. It says you have to meet state and local regulations, really, and it doesn't say much more than that. It's not as prescribed as the other ones. It hasn't been as controversial. It just hasn't really kicked in as some of the other goals have. Recreational needs got extensively revised about, 5 or 8 years ago over siting of destination resorts. So instead of meeting what you might think recreational needs are, it's really mostly about people who want to put big resort communities in the middle of ag and forest land. And so that has become kind of very specific to that need rather than as broad as I think it was originally intended. Energy conservation, you might think in the last 10 years or so that might have taken on a higher priority and become more complex and challenged over time, but indeed it has not. It's actually a very simple rule. It says you just have to maximize energy based on sound economic principles. pretty generic. I think there are so many other rules and regulations that overlie the use of energy that it just hasn't become as important in the land use laws of the state. And then protecting the Willamette River Greenway, another very important component. If the Willamette River runs through your community, there are laws that protect it from development. You have to set back so far. You have to respect the fact that that river is there. The final set of goals relates to coastal protection. So those protect estuarine resources, coastal shorelands, beaches and dunes, and then the actual ocean itself. And like many of the other resource-based goals, what it requires is that you inventory those resources in your community. You rank them, give them some significant, protect the significant ones, and try to find a way to balance that with competing development pressures. So back in 2009, so this was about, I think, 30 years or 25 years into land use planning in Oregon, there was a commission appointed called the Big Look Commission, and their job was to take a look at how has this been working. And indeed, they found some ways in which it had worked well and some ways maybe not as well. The most effective components that the Big Look Commission found was that agricultural land indeed was being preserved. It was no longer being converted at an astronomical rate from agricultural land to urban development, suburbs, sprawl outside of urban growth boundaries, that had been curtailed pretty significantly through the implementation of the Oregon planning land use laws. Downtowns had been revitalized. The efforts to focus growth inside urban growth boundaries made them work. There was enough focus in those areas to make downtowns have a comeback. Oddly enough, decreasing racial segregation happened in communities where that are in Oregon that are affected by those laws. Also, less use of non-motorized, or more use of non-motorized vehicles. And in the urban areas, they found that there was increasing personal income and increased retail activity. So why was this happening? Well, the speculation was that the fact that all communities are required to plan and implement the plan and work together to do so helped to make it more effective here than it is in other states. Many states don't have the same kind of requirements that Oregon does. Also, the state's interest in the community and developing the community needed to be considered. And so it wasn't just left up to individual communities to protect those areas. The state's interest had to be considered. I just had somebody talk to me ahead of time about the resistance to adopting Senate Bill 100 and enforcing it. I lived in Washington State and was a planner there in the 1990s when the Urban Growth Act was adopted, which was essentially a parallel to Oregon's growth management. When in the 70s, Washington and Oregon went in two different directions. In the 1970s, Washington State went down a path of environmental protection rather than land use planning, looking at it by a land use model. So they created a local state environmental policy act, and every action had to be analyzed against all of these environmental constraints. It was very environmentally conscious. Oregon, in reaction to the 1970s environmental movement, went through a very different route. They went with, how can we aggregate land uses in a way that protect our resources? And so when I moved from Washington to Oregon, I was surprised that the environmental laws here, because Oregon had a reputation for great environmental laws, I think you mentioned that, but in fact, the laws here were really more about land use than the environment, and I was surprised that the streams were not protected the way that I had been required to do in Washington. But also, in Washington, they didn't have the same constraints about where growth could go. And so it's been an interesting study to see those two competing methods compared one to the other. By about the year 2000, maybe a little before, both states had adopted the other's frame of mind, so they both were going down the land use and the transportation, or the land use and the environment track at the same time. But Oregon had a big head start on the land use track, and you can see it here. You know, if you drive from Salem to Portland, you can see where the urban growth boundary is. If you go out and drive along Cordon Road, you can see where the urban growth boundary is. One side is urban and the other side is agriculture. And I think it's that long legacy of land use planning that we've had in Oregon that has given that sense of what our state is like. And it makes us unique, special, and inviting, I think, to people. So not everything worked, though. Here's where they found problems. Counties were a little hesitant to enforce some of the land use laws. Counties tend to be a little more conservative. They tend to be wanting to go along with what their residents might want, and so non-farm dwellings have crept onto some of the agricultural land which was intended to be preserved. They also found that as growth was concentrated inside UGBs, there's a vulnerability to natural disasters inside the UGB, that there's a lack of real citizen involvement. So remember how important citizen involvement was? But the fact is that those modes and methods don't always work so well. And I think as time goes on and people communicate and participate in different ways, as time goes on, I know everybody looks around, I'm thinking, is my phone ringing? But I don't think it is. Citizen involvement may need to be just a different thing. I went to a presentation about gaming, which I thought was really interesting. The presenter was in the video game business, and she talked about using gaming as a way of citizen participation. So how could you create a game where you could build your community and you could have input through that process? I think we're going to see a lot more of that as time goes on. Instead of the public notices and the hours and hours of public testimony that happens, that sometimes is not as representative as you might think. It can be very isolated to a specific area, and it makes it hard, I think, for decision makers to make decisions that are based on good community values, but also respect what their constituents want. When you have all the people who live next door to the apartment building standing up and saying they don't want it, and you don't have anybody there but the developer saying this is a good thing because there are people who don't have houses and we can build inexpensive houses here, it's hard. It's hard to make those decisions. So finding a way to balance those interests and get involvement at different levels, I think is going to be a big challenge in the future. The other big problem, and you see it, is it did have an impact on increasing housing prices. Maybe not as much as what I've heard developers argue. I can't tell you how many times I've sat on panels with the home builders, and they're saying, well, it's more expensive here in Oregon, and I'm saying, well, it's not any more expensive here than it is in California, because of that debate. And so I don't think the prices have gone up as high, but it does have an influence, so it makes it more expensive to live here. You know, essentially, we're all paying for the cost of having the kind of laws that we have and the environment that we have. So let me talk a little bit more about a local level. Remember how the system works? State law, cities and counties have to adopt it and they have to make decisions according to it. Well, a comprehensive plan has to have two main things, policies and maps. And the policies have to address the statewide planning goals, and they have to have provide an efficient land use supply for 20 years. And you may also then include local issues. And so I picked up a few goals from the Salem Comprehensive Plan just to give you a sense of what these tend to look like. Here are 3 goals out of the Salem Plan. Economic growth, which improves and strengthens the economic base, should be encouraged. New development shall be encouraged to locate in areas where facilities are already available. So you can hear how those reflect on the statewide planning goals, right? The public facilities goal, the economic goal, and there are goals that address all of those different statewide planning goals. And then there's a local policy that's adopted into the local Salem Plan, which is a continuous 10-year supply of serviced, developable land should be maintained to avoid unnecessary increases in land prices created by artificial shortages. So that's consistent with the statewide planning goals, but it's kind of a unique twist that we have here in Salem. Then the other big important thing in a comprehensive plan are the maps. And what the maps do is they designate broad categories of land uses. So for instance, single-family residential, or multifamily, or commercial, or industrial. And also on those maps, there has to be an urban growth boundary. So every community has to establish an urban growth boundary. And I've got the picture here. This is the Salem-Keizer urban growth boundary. Can you see that okay? The dotted dashed line there are the city limits. Do you see how regular those city limits are? It's sometimes hard to tell whether you're in the city or not. And then the red line is the urban growth boundary. So you can see that most of the development is inside the city limits. Now, there are some areas there, and let me get my pointer here. Just talk among yourselves. So let's see if I can make this work. Okay. So you see the city limits, and you see the urban growth boundary in the red, and you see the city of Keizer to the north. And you can see the area inside the city, outside the city limits, but inside the UGB. Those are the areas where you would expect growth to occur for the city of Salem. Now, some of those areas are already developed. For instance, East Salem, lots of development there, but not inside the city limits, so not really available for development. But the UGB, the most recent studies show that the UGB has sufficient land supply to accommodate growth for the next 20 years. Still, even though it was, I think, the first UGB adopted in the state, and it hasn't been changed since then, you can see it had a lot of room to grow in it. Then the next map you have is that map that adopts the different land uses. This is kind of the close-up version of the one in Salem. And if you look at that, the colors are coded. There are, in case you don't know this, there are standard land use colors. So whenever you see yellow, which looks a little green there, that's single-family development. The orange is multifamily, and the red is commercial. So you get a sense of how the community is planned out here. This is I-5 running through our city, and this is Lancaster running through our city. What do you see along Lancaster there? Lots of commercial development. And then you have the residential development here around the boundaries. Kind of a typical plan. I remember when my daughter, who's 45 now, was 5, taking her to the my office while I was working on a comprehensive plan for Helena, Montana. And she sat in the corner and colored a map with red in the middle and orange around that and then yellow around that. So I knew she was on a solid ground. Well, there are also specific steps planned for how you develop the comprehensive plan. There are certain things that have to be done. It's very prescribed and can be very controversial. I think I was involved in Salem in trying to get our plan through periodic review, which means going through and making sure it's consistent with everything that's required. I think I spent about 15 years trying to get that through finally, and finally the state gave up on us, I think, and allowed it to be certified, but not without doing a lot of work in some of these areas. So, but what you have to have, and this all makes really good sense, because if you're going to plan a community, these are the things you need to think about. So you get a coordinated population projection. Why is it coordinated? Because it's handed down by the state, and if we're going to plan for growth for our state, it has to be coordinated from community to community. What happens if each community just picks their own number? And so what if Turner wants to have 5 million people and Salem decides we're only going to have 100,000 people, or everybody decides they want 100,000 people in all the little tiny towns? We're going to plan for growth in our state that's way more than what we're going to have. So those numbers are put out by the Portland State University and handed down to the counties, and then the counties work with the cities to allocate the numbers to the different communities for planning purposes. Each jurisdiction has to look at the environmental constraints in their community. So they have to determine how many wetlands, how many streams, what kind of flooding areas there are, and try to plan around those areas. They also have to look at the buildable land supply. So remember on the urban growth boundary, I told you that there's an area outside the city limits, but inside the UGB, but it's already developed, so it's not really available for development. So even though you might see it on a map, it's not really part of the buildable land supply. It's another controversial item. How do you count pieces of land? How buildable are they? Does that piece of land, is it going to accommodate 40 apartments, or is it going to accommodate 2 houses? All those decisions have to be made as you take a look at the buildable land supply, and as you start moving things around, like, do we have enough land to accommodate our growth? Well, maybe we need to switch the zoning from single family to multifamily on this piece, because now we have a greater supply of buildable land. So that's an issue that happens as you go through the step of looking at the buildable land supply. You also have to do a housing needs analysis. So that means that each community has to look at what the likely income levels are for people, the affordability of housing, and if you have the right types of housing to meet the needs of the people who live in your community. Not an easy task, and not always accomplished well. And it's left to the market to actually supply it. So land use planning gives you the supply of land. It does not build the structures that you're counting on. That falls to the market. And so if your market isn't driving to meet the needs of the community, and frequently it isn't, because developers make more profit when they build single-family homes. They lose money usually, at least if they build below-rate housing. Apartments. So frequently you can be out of whack with that. So you can have a lot of land designated, but you don't have the land available. You can have a lot of land designated, but you don't have the developers or the market driving it the right direction. Now, the fact of the matter is, in most communities, and especially in Salem, we have been hugely short of multifamily land for a long time. But it's such a controversial thing to rezone property from single family, which is what most of it comes out of, to multifamily, that it's very difficult to do. I worked on an effort back in the 90s, I think, where we had recognized that we didn't have enough multifamily land and tried to go through the city and systematically rezone about a couple hundred acres of multifamily land across the community. And we held one public hearing that was an 8-hour all-day Saturday session. And that wasn't enough. We had to have more time for the public input for that. You also have to do an economic opportunities analysis. So, related to how much income are people going to have, what kind of jobs are there going to be, and how are we going to supply those jobs, and how are we going to supply the facilities for those jobs. So that also has to be looked at. Do we have the right kind of land to accommodate those kind of jobs? So you have to set goals and policies. You have to actually prepare the plan. You have to implement it, and then it gets periodically reviewed. And I see that it's probably time to take a break right now, and this is a good place to do that. If anyone, I think you probably have questions so far, and we'll come back after the break, and we'll talk a little bit more about implementing the plan, and we'll talk about some issues in planning and do a couple of case studies here in Salem. Now, I know the routine here. Wait till the mic comes.
This is Ken. I'm just curious if you have any insight into the long-term transportation plan for Portland and Salem, I-5. It seems to me I'd rather drive the 30 miles to Salem, we live in Wilsonville, than to drive the 17 into Portland, and it can take 2 hours sometimes. What happens to all these plans when they can't afford to build new highway system, or won't? I
don't know that I have any particular insight into that other than what I see around, but building your way out of transportation problems is nearly impossible to do. It is so expensive for the infrastructure. Most planners will lean on different modes of transportation. How can we get people out of their cars and into vehicles that move more than one person or two people at a time in order to reduce the amount of traffic on the roads, because it's so expensive and people don't want to pay the price. There's a huge debate about the bridge here in Salem. Do we need that bridge across to West Salem? Traffic indications would tell you, yes, the cost is outrageous. So how do you balance that? Most people would say, let's try to find other modes of operation, or of transport. But it's a tough problem, And the I-5 in particular is a huge need for that for goods transportation as well. So you see the trucks, when the economic downturn happened, one of the first things that happened is there were so many fewer trucks on the highway, and now it's loaded back up again.
Hi, Roz here, and thanks, Vicki, for your long contribution to planning in Salem. Now that we all have a good foundation in comprehensive planning, I hope we'll all feel motivated to participate in Salem's new comprehensive plan update that is actually started, and the first public meeting for that is November 5th. So I hope everyone will feel interested in following that process. So as a person interested in planning, do you have comments about that process, and how will you as a citizen participate in that? I hope you do plan to participate, because you certainly bring a lot of knowledge and expertise to the table.
I hadn't thought about participating. I've really kind of stayed away from planning because it's so controversial and so political that I have stayed kind of away from planning, but maybe I will participate in it. I looked briefly, and I actually had lunch with the planning director to talk about this a little bit, and she was telling me about the starting the process off, and they're excited about it and are looking forward to working on it. I think they've had some, and it's so hard to do this right. I can tell you, it only takes one little stumble that gets blown out of proportion that can take a really good thing and set it the wrong way and not accomplish it. And I think they had a little stumble. There's a little confusion, I think, about the advisory committees that are working on it. But you have to just kind of charge through that. I think they have a good process laid out, and I think they'll make their way through it over time.
This is Jerry. I'm wondering how much can cities control the amount of population growth they get, or do they just have to accommodate the amount of population growth that materializes?
Well, that's a good question. There are some kind of subtle controls over population growth from cities. So utilities are a really good controller of that, because you cannot build houses, buildings close together without having facilities for them. If you don't have water and sewer, then you can't do it. So one method of controlling how much growth occurs is how much you provide in utilities. But most cities don't do that. They will respond to what the call is. You know, most cities want growth. They depend on growth for taxes that pay for the kinds of things that communities want. And so usually they are responding to what the expected growth is. And growth drivers, you know, they're hard to predict. Look at Central Oregon, where they've had the big farm, the server farms put in. And it's really, and Bend, which has grown tremendously. It's not always easy to predict.
Vicki, it's time for our break, and we have quite a few more questions, and we're wondering how you'd like to handle that.
Let's take the break. I think everybody's probably ready for a break, and then we'll come back, and after the end of the next part, I'll just answer any old question.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we have a plan, right? We went through all that rigmarole to adopt a comprehensive plan. And it got sanctioned by the state, and we're all happy, right? Well, actually, in planning, usually nobody's happy. Because you make everybody a little bit unhappy, and then you know that you've been successful. So how do you make it happen? Well, that's a key component to planning, of course. And zoning is a huge aspect of that, but it's not the only way. The way you make decisions in communities makes a big difference in how you implement the plan. So the capital improvement plan, that's how the city spends its money to build infrastructure. That's hugely important. If you don't build it in the right order and in the right place, your plan's not going to work. And if you do, it is going to work. The city budget, how you allocate, it's another allocation of scarce resources. There's only so much money to go around. How you allocate that, and if doing that consistent with what your vision is for the community is critical to making a plan happen. Agreements with other governments. How you work with others to make it happen is what makes it work. If Kaiser doesn't go along with Salem, which frequently it hasn't, it creates big problems. If Marion County doesn't agree that the urban growth boundary should be here instead of there, or if they don't agree about how they're going to provide services among themselves, that creates problems too. And special area plans, smaller plans, neighborhood plans are one of the ways that you can implement a plan. So you kind of zero down into a specific neighborhood and involve those people, and through your neighborhood associations, which are key components in many communities in making planning happen. And in fact, in Salem, and I think many places, neighborhood associations are the citizen participation mechanism. They are the place that the city counts on to go to involve citizens at a ground level. But let me talk about a couple of the big kinds of implementation: zoning and subdivision. So zoning sets out detailed types of land uses. So a comprehensive plan sets out general land uses. For instance, the Salem Area Comprehensive Plan has 19 land uses in it. They're public, residential, multifamily, broad. But the zoning ordinance has 32 different land use classifications in it. So it's a much more refined look at land use as it's applied through the zoning ordinance, which is the law by which you have to abide when you develop land. It separates one use from another frequently, although that's kind of falling out of vogue these days. It can create character, so the size of the lot that is permitted, the way the setbacks are directed can make a neighborhood feel a certain way. It includes setbacks, rear yards, parking requirements, landscaping requirements, all of the things when you, like me, I'm building a house, all the things that have to be complied with when you do that. And it sets the rules for how development occurs, and it can't be changed without looking at the comprehensive plan. Why is that? Why couldn't you change the zoning without looking at the plan? Because the plan is based on the population that you're going to have and the needs of your community, and if you change the zoning and it's not consistent with the comprehensive plan, then your plan's not going to work. So when zone changes occur, there has to be a review of the comprehensive plan to make sure that it's consistent. Here's a little bit more of an illustration on comp plan versus zoning. So this is us right here, Tokyo University, and here's the neighborhood around us. This is the comprehensive plan designation for this part of town. You can see that this area is all kind of that orangish brown color. And there's two colors, there's red and blue. Blue is kind of a public use, and red is commercial use. If you look at the zoning map, and I'm sorry it doesn't show up here nearly as well, but here we are at Tokyo University. So in the comp plan, this is all residential multi, so it's all multi-family, this whole area. And this is all red is the commercial. But when you look at the zoning map, there are two different, I don't know if you can pick this out, but there are actually two different colors there, because this is RM2 zoning, which means you can have up to 18 apartments on a lot there. And this is RD zoning, which means you can only have a duplex. So while it's all multifamily in the comprehensive plan, it's two different kinds of multifamily zoning. Same with the commercial. So this is where the train station is, right here. It's commercial on the plan. Well, here, this is commercial retail, and this is commercial general. And guess what one of the differences between commercial retail and commercial general? The commercial general allows train stations, and the commercial retail doesn't. So it's just, the retail is a little bit more focused on retail sales, and the general is a broader definition of commercial, and that's reflected not so much in the comprehensive plan and more in the refinement of the zoning. Land division, you probably know it as subdivision, is when you divide up a piece of vacant land so it can be developed into lots. In Oregon, in most states, you can't buy a piece of property unless it's been legally subdivided. So that means somebody has looked at the way the lots are broken down and assured that they have the services necessary. All right, don't look there yet. The services necessary to provide for those lots. And it sets the size of the lots and makes it available to develop. You cannot build on a lot until it's been legally subdivided. So that's another key way that cities control growth and how they work. This is my husband's favorite picture. He found it for me. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so what are the big issues in planning? What did I run into as a planner for all those years? I can tell you parking is incredibly important to people. If you live in a neighborhood where there's not enough parking, you know how important it is. And it's a big struggle too, because there's this struggle between we don't want to encourage more car use, but we want to accommodate the cars that we have. And so our parking requirements tend to be minimums and maximums. So you have to have at least this many spaces, but you can't have more than this many spaces so that you don't use up all your land for parking. And it's used as a tool to discourage people from driving, which can be very frustrating when you're in a hurry and you want to get out and run into a store and there's not enough parking there. But in the battles that I've sat through, many, many times, it's been there's not enough parking for this use. It's a huge battle. Signage, I put that in there because I think planners are the only people in the world who use the word signage. It means signs. But that's another battle. I recently, I have some nightmares about signs. When I was a young planner in Bellingham, Washington, I remember, and I was just, working the counter, talking to people who came in the door, and somebody wanted to build a hotel, and they came in the door, and we're talking about the signage requirements. And stupidly, I think, he said, well, I want to do a sign this big. And I said, oh, well, you can do a bigger sign than that. And so this guy said, oh, wow, thanks. And he went and put up the biggest, ugliest hotel sign. And I recently stayed at that hotel, and it's still a nightmare to me, and it's been 30 years. Traffic, as I said before, that's the #1 complaint of everybody all the time. And some of it, I don't know, maybe it's just intolerance. We're not very good at tolerating a lot of traffic. And some of it is misperception, some of it is true, but that's what people worry about. They're really concerned about traffic, and it is a huge, it gobbles up a lot of our time. People spend a lot of time in their vehicles trying to get around communities. And when I had people coming in and complaining, it was frequently they didn't want that traffic on their street. Here's one of my things about transportation. People complain about the buses because they're not full. They go see an empty bus go by, or the bus has 1 or 2 people on it. But when you look at the amount of streets that we have and how many times there are vehicles on them, I mean, the street in front of your house, isn't it mostly vacant all the time? And that's a huge investment. So it works in both those situations. Property values are another thing. People really worry about their property values. Probably the most controversial case, maybe not the most, but a big controversial case was about a crematorium. So that's got all kinds of issues in it. It mostly displayed itself as a concern about property values, quality of life, certainly. But there were, hundreds of people who came to testify against a crematorium. And trees are a huge issue for people. I worked here in Salem on developing the tree protection ordinance that we have in place now. That took years to do, and it was exceedingly controversial and exceedingly full of compromises. And sometimes laws get adopted that aren't intended to ever be enforced. They're more of a statement about what you want than what actually is enforced to happen. And some of that was true with the tree protection ordinance. But also, there was a big push of people cutting down all their trees before the ordinance went into effect, which was a terrible outcome, but probably better than never protecting trees, because sooner or later, if the trees were going to be protected, that step had to occur. So those are, some frequent issues that come up. And I think there's some coming up, some big ones coming up, and I don't have the answers about how to deal with these, but I think they're going to be land use issues. And you see one already, housing, really, really important. The homeless population, of course, is huge, not just here, all up and down the West Coast. I think that's true. and the cost of housing and how you provide it and how we accommodate that in our community is going to be critically important in the future and even right now. And housing the unhoused is expensive, and it's so divorced from the impacts that it has. It makes it hard to evaluate the investment in it. So if people are housed and they have the services they need, they're a lot easier to take care of in our community, and they have much better lives. But the systems that suffer if they're not are police and hospitals and things that aren't related to the budgets that cities are necessarily investing in or the funds where housing money comes from. So it makes it really hard to solve that problem. Climate change, of course, is another huge thing. I remember hearing a few years ago, before I retired, so that was 5 years ago, resiliency planning. That was kind of the buzzword. If you didn't believe in climate change, you could do resiliency planning, though, because you always needed to be resilient. Well, what we're being needed to be resilient about is what's happening in our climate. And you can really see it now. The forest fires are probably the biggest impact that we've suffered here in the Northwest. I remember hearing that we were likely to be a refuge for people who were suffering from climate change, that we would be inundated with refugees, climate change refugees coming here, because it was a place where the impacts were going to be perhaps less. But I'm not so sure with the impact of forest fires. That's made quite a difference in our community. And those are things we're going to have to wrestle with in the land use world and how we can make that better. Okay, well, I wanted to, my earlier discussion sounded all high and mighty and very theoretical, and it all works great together. And so I thought I'd talk about a couple of current cases that I dug up and how it applies on the ground and why it gets so sticky and maybe doesn't work as well as we all hope it does. So Costco is moving. Do you all know that? Good. And guess what? It's controversial. It's moving from where it is on Mission Street to Kubler, the intersection of near Kubler and Battle Creek. And I just wanted to kind of build that case. And it goes a little bit like this. That land was inside the UGB when the UGB was adopted. By the way, does everybody know what UGB means? Do you know that this is the only state in the country where you can say UGB and everybody in the room knows what you're talking about? And it's the only state that I know of that has a statue, Tom McCall in Riverfront Park, you've seen that statue, it actually says land use on it. So that property was inside the UGB when the UGB was adopted way back in the 1970s. So it's always been deemed to be urbanizable property, always thought of to be in the future of development for the city of Salem. And it was outside the city limits, however, and was annexed in 2001. So how does annexation work here? Well, typically what happens is as land gets ready to develop and needs services is when it becomes annexed into the city. Now that's not a pure case because as I showed you on the UGB, some land was already developed and it's inside the UGB but outside the city limits. But for the most part, one of the controls of how growth occurs is when annexation occurs. Now it shouldn't be the debate about whether development occurs there. Why is that? Because that happened when the UGB was set. Because in order for the city to accommodate the growth, they have to have enough land for 20 years, and to do that, they've got to use that UGB land up. And so question should not be, we don't want growth to occur here. The question should be, what kind of growth, and do we have the facilities now to accommodate it? That can be a challenge when it comes to land use law. I have sat in debates about annexation, and there's kind of a no-growth community about not wanting annexation to occur without, say, for instance, a vote of the people, which actually is no longer true here in Salem. Do you remember the ballots you used to get, and they had all those annexations? I want you to know that I had a file on annexations for one of those years when the votes were, and it was this high with paperwork for those annexations for that election. So I got off track there, sorry. So annexation is about the timing of growth and the provision of services, and not about whether growth should occur. That's the way it's structured. It doesn't always work that way, and I think many people misunderstand that and will argue about the fact that as we annex this land, it means it's going to grow. Well, yes, but we really decided it was going to grow there years ago. So in 2001, that land was annexed, and it was, in the comprehensive plan, it was designated as residential back with the UGB. And when it was annexed, it was still residential land in the comprehensive plan, but there was a statement in the voter's guide or on the ballot that said it was planned to be used for commercial uses. And so in 2007, lo and behold, someone bought that land and they decided to bring in a comprehensive plan change for it. And that was a very controversial debate. I think probably mostly about the traffic impact. And that happened in 2007. I'm going to go back and talk about that a little bit. And the final step in the process is site plan approval. So that means that there's a check to see that the final design of the actual project meets the rules and regulations. So you can see kind of the 4 important steps here in developing property. Step number 1, is it inside the UGB? Is it developable, urbanizable land? Step number 2, is it in the city? Does it have services? Step number 3, what is the comprehensive plan designation for it? And step number 4, does it meet the rules of the day? That's the sequence. So let's talk about that particular piece of property a little bit. So in 2007, a developer purchased the property, a big developer from Portland, and asked to change the property from developing residential to commercial. There was a 55-page decision issued on that after it went to the city council, was appealed to the state, and then back to the city council. And the finding was that, yes, it can be rezoned. And the case studied the statewide goals and how this particular proposal to change the comprehensive plan from residential to commercial, how does that meet the statewide goals? It had to be analyzed because they're changing the plan, right? So you have to go back to the statewide goals and make sure it works. So one was the economy. Take a look at the economic opportunities analysis. Well, that analysis, which was in process at the time that this zoning changed, but some of the data was out there, indicated that within the Salem UGB, there was enough land, in fact, more land than needed for housing, but not enough land for commercial development. So that was the basis of part of the argument to change this, is that we needed more commercial land in Salem and not as much housing. And also the argument was it's inside the UGB, so of course it's urbanizable and should be developed. It's inside the city limits and the facilities are available. And there was a condition attached to the zone change associated with the comp plan change that required traffic mitigation. So the improvements that happened on Kubler, do you remember how Kubler was widened there by the freeway not too long ago? A lot of that was paid for by this developer in order to make this project work. And that was a condition of the zone change, to make those transportation improvements. So guess what? That developer, when he gets ready to come in and Costco knocks on their door and says, we want to move to your property, he's expecting to get approved, right? Right? He went through this zone change. He went through this comp plan change. It meets all the goals. And so, now let me go back just a step here. Also, besides the statewide planning goals, when the comp plan was changed, there were local criteria to meet. And those local criteria had to do with whether the property was, whether the change was logical and harmonious, whether it met the intent of the comp plan, and if there are benefits to the public. Those are a little wishy-washy. You can argue those things. The city council at the time agreed that it was logical and harmonious because it was on a major thoroughfare and could be accommodated there, that it met the intent of the comp plan because they went through all the statewide planning goals and they analyzed the housing and the commercial and it all seemed to work. And that there were benefits to the public as a result of it because there'd be a new shopping area in town. So 2018 comes up and here comes Costco and they want to move to that site and they're pretty sure that that's just okay to do. But the neighbors still aren't very happy with having that great big development right next to where there's quite a bit of housing. Anybody live near there? Aha. Yeah, and I'm moving not too far from there. So they come in with their basically building permit approval for site plan review. And again, there's an analysis of it. And again, there's an opportunity for public input. So the decision on this site plan review was issued last week. And I took a look at it, and here's kind of how the analysis went. Well, it works for traffic because this, by the way, was a 52-page decision. Remember the last one was a 55-page decision. So I can tell you there's a lot of work that goes into this stuff. Does it meet the rules? Traffic-wise, yes, because there has to be a traffic impact analysis. So when somebody comes in with a big project like this, they hire traffic engineers and they study whether or not the system can handle it. And because of the improvements that the developer had put in earlier, the traffic analysis shows that it can handle that traffic. I don't know that the adjacent residents would agree with that. I suspect that there'll be an appeal. So keep your ears open. You can follow this as it goes through. My guess is it'll be appealed to the city council. And they'll be debating traffic engineers, arguing with one another about whether or not the traffic works here. But the analysis that was provided and looked at by the city showed that it does meet it. And so the city has approved this case. Tree preservation was another issue, and here's a little bit about the tree ordinance. So there's a stand of oaks. White oaks, Oregon white oaks are protected in the city of Salem if they are of a certain size. And there are 15 or so Oregon white oaks on this property, I think, that meet that requirement. But what the ordinance says is they're only protected in certain cases. And one of the cases where it's only encouraged is for commercial and industrial development. So if you have a commercial proposal and it's necessary for the development of the site to remove those trees, then they may be removed. So that's a pretty subjective choice. I can tell you that it was designed to be subjective so that as proposals came in that could be evaluated and choices could be made that would be allowed to allow those trees to come down. It was a compromise that was made in the process of trying to protect Oregon white oak trees in Salem. And by golly, here, they proved to the satisfaction of the staff that it was necessary to take those trees down. So that was approved, and the requirement was that they plant new ones, which of course replacing, a 100-year-old white oak with a sapling takes a long time. But it was intended to operate that way. It was intended to allow for commercial development without obstructing it too much. It does meet all the setback use requirements, landscaping, height, parking, screening requirements from residential. It meets all those rules, and it meets the requirements that were conditions of the zone change when it was changed from residential to commercial, which limited the size of the building. I think it was to 300,000 square feet, which is what the traffic was based on. I think the Costco building's somewhere around 250,000 square feet, so it's within that framework. So that's one case study that's in the works right now. Keep your ears open on that one, because I think there'll be a lot more about it in the future, probably be another year before this gets worked out one way or another. Let me give you one more case. Let's see what time it is. I'll give you a quick case study, and then we'll talk about some ending things, and then I'll take some questions. So guess what else moved? The Union Gospel Mission is going to move. Did you all know that? And it's going to move to the new site, to where their store is now, which is directly across from where the police facility is going to be built. So would you think that the Union Gospel Mission might be a controversial move? Yeah, it was. But it was approved in the spring of this year. And it was zoned for that purpose. So the zoning and the comprehensive plan both allow that kind of facility in the site where they want to move to. But it's allowed as a conditional use permit because of the kind of use it is, because it has probably extraordinary impacts above and beyond standard kind of residential development. It's allowed as a conditional use permit, which requires a hearing and allows the government to attach special conditions to it. Because typically, if a development meets the rules and regulations, you get a permit. Why is that important? Because people who develop land need to know if they can do what they want to do on their property. You want to know that for your property. It's a little different with a conditional use permit. And so the analysis of that is, does it meet the rules, and does it need special conditions? So here's what they found on it. They put conditions on it that limited the overnight guests to 300, and a condition that requires video surveillance around the clock, required cover storage for their guests' things. The primary entrance was not to be on Commercial Street. It had to be monitored 24 hours a day, and there had to be an indoor restroom. So in this case, the hearings officer and eventually the city council took a look at this specific proposal and tried to figure out what can we do to minimize the impacts of this use that is permitted here. So they took their best stab at it. I think this one is through the process and likely to be constructed. So let me see. I kind of want to leave you with a couple things. I can't overemphasize how important the Western land ethic is in land use planning. You know, we are people who think that it's my land and you can't tell me what to do with it. And indeed, there are constitutional protections of land in private ownership. But it makes it hard to regulate land. And you saw it, the huge issue at Malheur, where people who don't think that the government has a right to regulate land use object. And it's critical to them. It's a fundamental right from their perspective. Now, land use planning is well established legally in this country, and there is a justification for it, but it doesn't make it any easier to walk into up to a farmer and say, you can't sell that land for a subdivision because you're zoned for agricultural use. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's fundamental to making the system work. And planning is complicated, it's political, and it's really, really hard to do. I remember I worked in Bellingham, Washington, and the state ferry that went from Seattle to Alaska was proposed to be moved to Bellingham. And it was my job to evaluate the application for that, particularly from a shorelines perspective. So I got that case, and it was highly controversial. There were attorneys on both sides poring over the case, ready to appeal it, and there are so many steps and requirements in a land use decision, it's nearly impossible to not make a mistake somewhere because there are so many mistakes to be made. And I had left out sending a notice to one of the local tribes, which I didn't discover until long after it was over and there was an appeal. And I spent about a month of sleepless nights waiting to be discovered, which, don't tell anyone, I wasn't. So the ferry terminal is there, and I think it fits very well into Bellingham. But the complications and the political nature and the degree of detail that is needed in these cases is incredible. I finally kind of learned that when it comes to developers, all the rules in the world won't make a bad developer do a good job. They're going to find a loophole. And all the good rules and no rules at all don't make it any less likely that a good developer is going to do a good job. Nonetheless, the rules are important. And I know they're complicated, and I know they get influenced by politics. I've seen it happen. But it also has an outcome that is better in the long run. The other thing is, it takes a generation to see the outcome of planning projects. I mean, it just doesn't happen overnight. When I was in Bellingham recently, I was walking along a trail right along the waterfront, which wasn't there 30 years ago, which I imagined 30 years ago. And I finally thought, wow, 30 years later, I actually see something that happened. And most people aren't very good. They're not very good at waiting that long for the outcome. It's really about planning for our children. And maybe for those of us of a certain age, that's more important. You begin, I think, to think about what are going to happen to the next generation and what is our legacy for that next generation. And I think sometimes in our age group, we can be kind of conservative people. And I think that the more participation that looks forward from someone my age is really helpful. I think it really helps to inform the wisdom of the decision making. Oh, and there are some conflicts in planning. Flexibility versus predictability. Guess what everybody wants? They want both of those things. They want to have ultimate flexibility about what they can do with their property, but they want to know exactly what the neighbor can do with their property. And those two just don't go together. Probably half my time was spent on trying to balance between those two things and trying to write rules and regulations that provide both, which is really hard to do. And density versus sprawl. John Kitzhaber said there are two things Oregonians hate, density and sprawl. And it's true. But in the end, it's worth it. I really think it is. If you can't tell, maybe there's a little bit of preacher in me. But I'm a believer in land use planning. I spent my career at it. And I think, especially in a place like Oregon, where you can really feel and see the results, it's a positive thing. And it's worth the trouble and the angst that we go through to get there. And I think with that, I would be ready for questions again.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Wes. I'm wondering, is this confining of the deal about McNary High School and the Catholic Church out there in Kaiser?
Yes, yes, eminent domain.
Is that part of this organization?
Well, no, that's actually a school district issue, although cities do sometimes have to deal with that, but that's the school district. And, you know, eminent domain is the idea that governments, including school districts, have the right to take property from individuals at a reasonable price, even if those people don't want to sell it. It's seldom used, but it can be a critical component to making things happen for those governments, like the school. It's a good example. It's gotten more and more difficult over time. There's been some Supreme Court cases on eminent domain that have made it harder for governments to do that. It's, again, just like land use planning, it affects people's fundamental right to their property.
Sharon, I do have development in my background, married into a family of developers, so if there's a few of us might be here. However, raging environmentalist, and I've had extensive experience in Senate Bill 100, going around the state trying to prevent its repeal, and also water. So water and land use, very familiar with. And so I'm going to bring it down to, and have a lot of experience in it locally too, just to a couple of things of beware of government. Again, older, more experienced, more conservative, seeing what I wanted to happen and what is happening. So just a couple local things, and I want your reaction to it. One, Malheur was not about subdivisions, but having said that, I just had to put that up. Once when I was chairman of the Energy and Conservation Committee here in Salem, we tried to get a solar ordinance through, and that's about trees. That never has happened, to my knowledge, in this tree thing. So be aware of that. Sometimes you're going to solve one problem, and I know you touched on it. Excellent presentation, by the way. Now, main point. What is your reaction to there is a lack of this overview to things? I got into it to save agricultural land. Look at the U.S. Geologic Survey, and there's not much agricultural land. I was shocked. It has to have water. It has to have a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, Salem. Salem's in the heart of some of the best agriculture districts in the state. And where we should grow is east and north. I mean, not grow, excuse me. Agriculture is north and east. South, we have clay soil and rocks. West has no water, and it has rocky soil. So, two pet peeves. One, we had the best agriculture. It was just primo on the other side of the urban growth boundary, that whole area there. And what happened? Well, the county came in. Oh, we need a detention center. And then, oh, by the way, let's put cement down the wells. Oh, and we also are going to cement and have a huge truck thing. You know, what is it, FedEx, Vermont, whatever. And just taking away flat agricultural land when it could have gone south. And the other thing is, so government trumps everything. And then I've went through 3 bridge studies, was on them. And we spent more money. We could have built 2 bridges with all the regulations, and growth should occur there. So your response to a government?
Well, let me just talk about that. So what I know about the Salem urban growth boundary is it was highly influenced. Salem, you're right, in the heart of the Willamette Valley and this whole valley. And by the way, thank you to you and the others who have come up and said to me, you know, I worked on Senate Bill 100. I know about it. I advocated for it. Thank you all for that, because I'm a benefactor and I appreciate it, and there are measurable results. Salem had one of the earliest urban growth boundaries, and that battle between agricultural land in particular and the urban growth and sprawl in the Willamette Valley is, I think, what motivated Senate Bill 100 more than anything. And you can see in the Salem urban growth boundary that, that line is drawn along Cordon Road, and I think it's Cale to the north, separating those really highly valued agricultural land from the urban, and the growth areas were mostly to the south and to the west, which are expensive because they're hilly and they don't have water, but you can solve those problems. You cannot solve the agricultural problem. And so I think there was that was done thoughtfully and reflects that. I'm not sure what the cement plant issue was. It sounds like maybe that was a county issue, and counties, sometimes they're a little more political in applying some of these rules. So sometimes I know the reality of what happens, believe me, after 35 years. I know the reality of what happens compared to what you want to see happen. But I think the effort is still worth it.
Well, you sort of answered my question, because I was going to ask you if the quality of the soil was taken into account when they set the UGBs.
You bet it's required to be taken into account. If and when Salem looks at expanding its UGB, that'll be something that'll have to be considered, is what's the value of the soil, and how broken up is the land into parcel. Parcelization is another one of the factors.
Paul here. This is sort of an example of how solving one problem aggravates another. I live over in West Salem, and I noticed on the map there was one big parcel that was for multifamily housing, and I just saw on the Statesman Journal 330 units of multifamily housing. It's immediately adjacent to Orchard Heights Roads, which is a 2-lane road, which a quarter of a mile down the road feeds directly onto Wallace Road. And if anybody's been over in West Salem, so you are seeing roughly maybe another 500 cars, multiple trips per day, feeding directly onto Wallace Road. So you've solved a housing issue, but you've aggravated a traffic issue.
Although the land use laws are designed to try to work those things together. So I can tell you now whether it actually works out in the end. I can tell you that there was a study that was done to determine whether or not that traffic system could handle the flow from the additional trips. And that when the zoning was set, there was some analysis that went with that. It doesn't mean that things don't change as time goes along and it doesn't work out, but the land use laws are designed to try to work those things together.
Vicki Jinks,
I know you don't look like you're buying it at all. Yes.
Back up here. Growing up in the Santa Clara Valley in California in the 50s, even as a child, it made me cry to see the strawberry fields and the apricot orchards torn up. So moving to Oregon was really a blessing to me. But one of the things that has always surprised me, and maybe you have some insight, is the participation of 24J in the process of development. And it seems to me when I grew up, a development would go in and part of the authorization was the local school and probably a park. Whereas here it seems like 24J is always going, oh, look, there's a bunch of houses, we better build a school. and that rumor that I heard is that they have not participated much in a lot of the planning process, although there has been a place at the table. Could you give us any insight into that?
Yeah, by law, they are required, cities and school districts are required to work together and develop plans that address both needs. That doesn't, I think school districts have a particular problem because the student count can go up and down outside of whether there's more housing. A lot of that has to do with how many more kids does each household have, which is not necessarily as predictable as how many housing units there might be. So I think it's a little harder for them to predict, but there are requirements, and I worked with a school district over time. It's a little loosey-goosey the requirement for working with school districts, and so it didn't always have the most concrete outcome. But there is always, when there's a new subdivision or a new annexation, school districts are always asked to comment on it. My recollection is they frequently would say stuff like, we'll accommodate it as it arises, because I think they had trouble actually predicting what the impact might be on them, and frankly, funding it. Yes?
Hi there. Just a general question, maybe towards the end of our session here. There's a perception that while planning may delay, at the end of the day, the developers get their way. And what are your perceptions about that? Does planning really make a difference, or ultimately do the commercial developers, the landowners, et cetera, you gave the Costco example as one that's moving forward, and eventually probably it'll happen anyway. So how do you deal with that cynical view about the whole planning process? And you mentioned that no developers are in this room, so you can say whatever you want.
Well, I don't think I could have done this for 40 years if I didn't think it was worthwhile. So I think it works. Am I cynical? Yes. Have I seen developers get their way when maybe it wasn't appropriate? Yes. Have I seen developers get their way when maybe it wasn't appropriate? No. I've seen that happen both ways. For the most part, I think that good land use planning pans out, but not always. Yes?
This is Charlene. Some of us here in the room live at Capitol Manor.
Yes.
Over in West Salem, and they're doing a major plan. Mm-hmm. And things got started, and all of a sudden, somebody found out that the proper permit hadn't been whatever, and it delayed it for 6 weeks. My question is, where does the permit problem fit into all of this? Is the permits then of course the rumor mill started, and everybody said, well, many developers do not like building in Salem because the permit process is so slow. So I'm just curious as to where the permit process fits into the scheme of things.
I oversaw permits, so I know the problem. And it can be really slow. It's where the rubber meets the road. So the real detail of what has to happen happens at the permit stage. And there are lots of things that cause obstructions to that and stumbling blocks. Sometimes it's that the developer hasn't done their research ahead of time and they don't really know what they're getting into. A lot of times it's the development process itself, which is risky, and you can't know ahead of time where the problems are going to be. There might be soil problems or an archaeological site. You see them working out at the police station site with the spoons. I think they ran into a big archaeological issue that had to be panned out there. So I think it's a combination. I hope that Salem isn't especially slow. I know that when I was there, I took pride in trying to get permits through the process in a timely way because it was important. But I also know that sometimes developers will use that as an excuse. I remember being down in the mayor's office one day. She called me down, and she had a developer in the room who was complaining about the permitting process. And by golly, what that developer was telling her was not true. The permit was ready to go. It was an issue on his part. But also, it's just the complicated factor of how do you design and actually develop a piece of land. I think it's more likely it's going to go slower than faster.
Hi, this is Karen. I just have to have a little teaching moment here. Again, I've said this many times, that you can't pretend that this is just a European community, that you have to allow that there are other culture is here. So you can't just say, how do the Native Americans feel like this? You have to say that that's part of the community. And how you say it, I don't know how you say it. I can tell you, but I don't want to take that amount of time. But you have to consider that before you talk. And also, I want to just stress that any land taken before 1855 was illegal according to federal statutes. So please either say it that way or don't say anything about taking the land. And lastly, if any of you would say that a planner didn't include a community in the plan, how would you feel as opposed to if it was a tribe? And so I think those are important things that I just want to stress that you're learning, and I want to help you learn. Thank you.
Karen, thank you for standing up and saying that. I appreciate it. I think those things need to be said, and I will come and talk to you about how I could say it differently.
Well, thank you, Vicki. You have you've taken on the challenge and you met it. This is a complicated subject, but you made it understandable and enjoyable. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.